In 2008, an international research organization was founded that would seek to have a positive influence on relationships and policymaking within and between the countries of ASEAN and East Asia. This is AREA, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia.
When AREA was first mooted, the thinking was we need a very substantial economic research body.
It's very important for an organization like ASEAN to have the backing academically for what it wants to do. And that's why AREA fills in the gap and helps provide the research.
It's more about providing the information that's needed for the negotiators or for the political decision makers.
We are not a pure academic institution. We must do the more practical policy recommendation.
And AREA's role, of course, is also to promote the talking through of sensible policy developments, and it plays a fundamentally important role in that respect.
And AREA is now accepted as one of the major research institutes in East Asia as a whole.
After its first decade of input into the development of ASEAN, AREA must now be ready to meet the challenges of the future.
We believe that issues like sustainable development, like environment, issues like education, humanitarian aspect of it, which we think AREA has the capacity to develop expertise and provide policy recommendation to ASEAN.
AREA, hopefully in the not too distant future, will become like the OECDs of our region.
AREA will continue to contribute to the community building of ASEAN and East Asia.
At the current affairs where we witnessed lingering COVID-19 pandemic, global economic recovery remained unfavorable to be achieved. Global inequality rise to a level that never seen in the past decade. Mobility restriction policies resulting from COVID-19 prevention measures have disabled many communities to fulfill their daily needs. Risks of divisions between social groups exacerbated as the threat of scarring effect to the future generations, as well as increased risk of systemic default that put financial sector under pressure, have made the exit strategy from COVID-19 pandemic even more challenging to be executed. Such risks also result in prolonged trust deficit among countries that slow down efforts to tackle greater long-term issues, such as climate change and massive biodiversity extinction. All of these phenomena need to be followed with better formulation of economic and policy approach under one coordinated action. The Think 20, or better known as the T20, is the G20's official engagement group that connects think tanks worldwide. The T20 serves as a global ideas bank, bringing together experts from the most relevant think tanks and research institutes worldwide. The T20 develop and communicate research-based policy recommendations to the G20 leaders. In its 10th year, the T20 under the Indonesian presidency will be present to systematically produce practical policy proposals for G20 decision-makers. This year, T20 highlighted 3 strategic issues. First, promoting greater cooperation for stronger, balanced, and resilient recovery. Achieving resilient and inclusive economic recovery simultaneously by global economies is essential to reduce the risk of having prolonged crises that affect unevenly across social classes. Second, advancing concerted effort for inclusive and sustainable development. Post-pandemic development in times of changing climates needs to also consider environmental issues, while also inclusive to all communities and aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And third, managing digital transformation to utilize technological progress. The unprecedented digital transformation as a result from COVID-19 pandemic should align with innovation that benefits communities worldwide. These strategic issues will be discussed further by think tanks across the world under the coordination of T20 Indonesia's 9 task forces. Together, these task forces, as well as all T20 participants, will join under our series of events. Alongside the support provided by these task forces, T20 Indonesia will be led by our lead co-chairs as well as executive co-chairs. The T20 Indonesia, hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Institute for Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia, both are think tanks that play important roles in policy-oriented research. Recover together. Recover stronger.
The COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on lives, well-being, and economies in Asia and the Pacific, along with the rest of the world. Since the beginning of the pandemic at the start of 2020, ADB has committed more than $17.5 billion to help its developing member countries address the impacts of COVID-19 and address vaccination needs, and has mobilized a further $12.5 billion in co-financing from partners. From the earliest stages, ADB offered technical assistance to address Asia and the Pacific's most pressing needs, including medical equipment and supplies, improving laboratories, and training frontline workers. To mitigate the immediate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, ADB committed $10.2 billion to support governments' counter-cyclical expenditure programs in 26 countries. Some $501.7 million has been helping private companies provide medical equipment and essential services. And ADB committed $3.2 billion for trade finance, supply chain finance, and microfinance programs. ADB is also providing crucial knowledge to help countries better tackle the pandemic and shape a greener recovery. This includes databases on policy measures, supply chains, and economic impacts. As the world kickstarts a sustainable recovery from COVID-19, ADB is delivering comprehensive support to meet Asia and the Pacific's vaccine needs. Through a $9 billion Asia-Pacific Vaccine Access Facility, or APVAX, announced in December 2020, ADB is providing funding for vaccine procurement, logistics, and distribution. The initiative also supports important investments to build capacity in vaccine delivery, community outreach, and surveillance. Throughout its COVID-19 response operations, ADB is working closely with partners, including other international financial institutions, bilateral institutions, and the UN system. ADB is adapting with agility to the region's changing circumstances, working together with its developing member countries to rebuild for a long-lasting recovery.
In 2008, an international research organization was founded that would seek to have a positive influence on relationships and policymaking within and between the countries of ASEAN and East Asia. This is AREA, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia.
When AREA was first mooted, the thinking was we need a very substantial economic research body.
It's very important for an organization like ASEAN to have the backing academically for what it wants to do. And that's why AREA fills in the gap and helps provide the research.
It's more about providing the information that's needed for the negotiators or for the political decision makers.
We are not a pure academic institution. We must do the more practical policy recommendation.
And AREA's role, of course, is also to promote the talking through of sensible policy developments, and it plays a fundamentally important role in that respect.
And AREA is now accepted as one of the major research institutes in East Asia as a whole.
After its first decade of input into the development of ASEAN, AREA must now be ready to meet the challenges of the future.
We believe that issues like sustainable development, like environment, issues like education, humanitarian aspect of it, which we think AREA has the capacity to develop expertise and provide policy recommendation to ASEAN.
AREA, hopefully in the not too distant future, will become like the OECDs of our region.
AREA will continue to contribute to the community building of ASEAN and East Asia.
At the current affairs where we witnessed lingering COVID-19 pandemic, global economic recovery remained unfavorable to be achieved. Global inequality rise to a level that never seen in the past decade. Mobility restriction policies resulting from COVID-19 prevention measures have disabled many communities to fulfill their daily needs. Risks of divisions between social groups exacerbated as the threat of scarring effect to the future generations, as well as increased risk of systemic default that put financial sector under pressure, have made the exit strategy from COVID-19 pandemic even more challenging to be executed. Such risks also result in prolonged trust deficit among countries that slow down efforts to tackle greater long-term issues, such as climate change and massive biodiversity extinction. All of these phenomena need to be followed with better formulation of economic and policy approach under one coordinated action. The Think 20, or better known as the T20, is the G20's official engagement group that connects think tanks worldwide. The T20 serves as a global ideas bank, bringing together experts from the most relevant think tanks and research institutes worldwide. The T20 develop and communicate research-based policy recommendations to the G20 leaders. In its 10th year, the T20 under the Indonesian presidency will be present to systematically produce practical policy proposals for G20 decision makers. This year, T20 highlighted 3 strategic issues. First, promoting greater cooperation for stronger, balanced, and resilient recovery. Achieving resilient and inclusive economic recovery simultaneously by global economies is essential to reduce the risk of having prolonged crises that affect unevenly across social classes. Second, advancing concerted effort for inclusive and sustainable development. Post-pandemic development in times of changing climates needs to also consider environmental issues, while also inclusive to all communities and aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And third, managing digital transformation to utilize technological progress. The unprecedented digital transformation as a result from COVID-19 pandemic should align with innovation that benefits communities worldwide. These strategic issues will be discussed further by think tanks across the world under the coordination of T20 Indonesia's 9 task forces. Together, these task forces, as well as all T20 participants, will join under our series of events. Alongside the support provided by these task forces, T20 Indonesia will be led by our lead co-chairs as well as executive co-chairs. The T20 Indonesia, hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Institute for Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia, both are think tanks that play important roles in policy-oriented research. Recover together, recover stronger.
Good afternoon to our honorable guests and distinguished audience. Welcome to the second day of the 2022 CSIS Global Dialogue, an annual event held by the Center for Strategic and International Studies to discuss emerging global issues and their solutions.
This event is co-organized by the Asian Development Bank, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, and T20 Indonesia. This year, as the side event of T20 Indonesia, the dialogue takes the theme of G20 Indonesia, Windows for Recovering Together and Stronger.
On this honorable occasion, I, Gilang Kembara,
and I, Stella Kusumawardhani,
will be the hosts for this event.
Ladies and gentlemen, during the COVID-19 crisis, where many businesses collapsed and people fell into poverty, the government spent billions on stimulus and assistance. When the crisis recedes, the government will need to plan how to transition into a recovery phase in which stimulus would not be continuously given and rising debt issues should be dealt with. In the upcoming session titled Macroeconomic Issues in Prospect of Recovery, we will discuss how to address these challenges. Moderating the session will be Dr. Sin Young Park, Director of the Regional Cooperation and Integration Division in the Economics Research and Regional Cooperation Department of the Asian Development Bank. In her current capacity, Dr. Park manages a team of economists to examine economic and policy issues related to regional cooperation and integration, or RCI, and develop strategies and approaches to support RCI. During her progressive career within ADB, she has been a main author and contributor to ADB's major publications, including Asian Development Outlook, ADB's flagship publication. Prior to joining ADB, she served as economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, where she contributed to the OECD Economic Outlook. She received her PhD in economics from Columbia University. Before we commence, we kindly invite our participants to post questions and/or comments during the Q&A session. For the audience attending here at the venue, please provide your question to any of our organizers, whom will then pass them along to our moderator. For the audience attending virtually, please write your question at the Zoom Q&A box or YouTube comment section. I kindly suggest to keep your questions short and straightforward. Don't forget to inform us your name, affiliation, and the speakers whom you would like to address your question, if any. Without further ado, may I welcome Dr. Sin Young Park to chair the session. Dr. Park, the screen is yours.
you very much for a kind introduction. Well, welcome everyone to CSIS Global Dialogue 2022. We're very honored to have distinguished speakers and guests to this event. And today also we are starting session 3, macroeconomic issues in the prospect of recovery. Well, we have a very distinguished speakers for this session. Let me first introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Steen Claessens. Dr. Steen Claessens represents the BIS externally in senior groups, including the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, and the G20. Within the BIS, he leads policy-based analysis of the financial sector issues and oversees the work of secretariats of Committee on the Global Financial System, Markets Committees, and the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure. Prior to joining the BIS, he worked at the Federal Reserve Board, IMF, and the World Bank in various positions for 3 decades. He holds PhD in business economics from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Let me turn the floor over to Dr. Steensen, and you have about 15 minutes for your speech.
Thank you very much, Chinjon. It's a great pleasure to be here to speak to you today. I'm going to talk about the recovery, but a lot has happened in the last few months, so I'm going to focus on one item also because we don't have that much time, but I think it is the key item going forward, and that is inflation. Let me start by putting on my slides. So the issues that we expected last year was that we would have a recovery in 22, building on what we have seen in 21, which was a good year for the global economy. But as we went into 22, already there were some signs of weakening of the recovery. And on top of that, we had the conflict in the Ukraine, which really added a global shock to what already was becoming a more fragile recovery. As a result, we have a lot of uncertainty at the moment. There's many issues that we can discuss, but like I said, I want to focus on one, which is inflation, that's come to the fore in part due to the additional shock, but also already happening beforehand. Many of the forecasts that people have made are becoming obsolete. We saw that last week. IMF and others have come out with new revisions, but the span of the forecast is very large. So we have to acknowledge that we have much uncertainty here as we're going into 22 and the rest of the 23 and beyond. Let me show you some of the uncertainties that we're facing in the form of what we thought was going to happen and what is actually on the floor happening at the moment. So this shows you the GDP forecast as they evolved over 21 and 22. And we saw this decline that I mentioned to you already coming after what was a strong recovery in some of the countries, some declines in Europe, but also elsewhere, where we have downward revisions that now have been accelerating, of course, because of the crisis in the Ukraine. The impact on the EMEs had been more limited. So far, except for Eastern Europe, there was not a sharp correction yet, but it's coming. And some, of course, is in China, and Japan was already there a little bit, and particularly in China, of course. I'm going to talk more where there's an impact of the COVID and the COVID zero policy. But on top of this, already what was meant to be a slower recovery than we had maybe anticipated earlier, there is this shock. The shock added a lot to the global uncertainty. And again, it was already coming to some extent here on the left-hand chart. You see the commodity prices, not just oil and other energy sources, but also all the other wheat and corn and food prices, as well as minerals that have seen large increases since the outbreak of the war in February 23rd. And those have been continuing until today. So this is adding on to all the uncertainty that we have seen. And that's showing up, of course, in the GDP forecast that I mentioned to you. It's already showing up in the PMIs that we receive on a more frequent basis. And also, as I mentioned before, the COVID shock that's now clearly becoming an issue for China, and as a consequence, that is adding to global uncertainty, as the China is, of course, a key component of global demand. And we see the China PMI is declining sharply together with those of Hong Kong. We also see this correction coming, particularly in Eastern Europe, as I mentioned. So volatility remains high. So the forecast, as I mentioned, are really very uncertain where we may end up in this year. But what is clear is, among all of these uncertainties, that inflation has been rising very rapidly. We have been used to a period of very low inflation. The chart on the left gives you the picture for the advanced economies, where US is in red and the euro area is in blue. And we saw that both core and headline inflation had been low until middle of 21, but then started really to increase and has been increasing very sharply, of course, in the last few months. And the forecasts for this current year are very high, much above targets in both the euro area as well as in US. And in addition to that, of course, we've seen somewhat of an increase in Japan. In emerging markets, we had seen these increases much more and already earlier and coming on. And there we have now a very high inflation in some countries. I'm taking Turkey as a particular case, but that's maybe an exception. But overall, nevertheless, there's large increases in inflation in Eastern Europe and the like. The one exception is China, where still, relatively speaking, inflation is very low, and we haven't seen the upward revisions, at least not in CPMI. So the point is that the inflations are surprising us time after time, and that's also showing up in the forecast. If you here look at the forecast that analysts have made, professional analysts have made over the past 18 months or so, and you look at where they were in the beginning of 21 and where they are now, you see that they're catching up every time as prices increasing. That is typically not what you would expect, actually. Given that prices are high today, you would actually expect some base effect and prices to decline and forecasts in that sense to revert. But we've seen actually the surprises building on top of surprises. So this is really a question of a regime switch, at least for the advanced economies, but not only there, because also in emerging markets, we've seen these inflation surprises being quite consistent and quite persistent as well. So with that combination, the really question is, could we not see a regime switch in which interest rates would have to rise as well to contain this potential wage spiral that otherwise may emerge, that of course would really create trouble down the road in terms of economic, but also possibly financial stability. Now, monetary policy is acting. It's not that we haven't seen yet the monetary policy acting, but it is coming on very strongly now. And this is showing you on the left-hand chart just the difference between what we had in February 23 when the war started and today. And this is the increase, in other words, what is expected at the end of the year in the US, Canada, and the euro area, which is for the first two countries almost a percentage point more increase at the end of the year. So very sharp, abrupt increase in monetary policy in those two countries. The euro area, somewhat slower increase. The UK was already further ahead, so the increase is relatively smaller there. And again, another country, Australia, has also seen a very large increase in the implied policy rate for the end of 22 within a period of 2 months, which is a very sharp, of course, change. The countries on the right have seen that as well. Eastern Europe is in the middle bucket there, besides the Czech Republic, but also Hungary and Poland. Sharp increases up to 3 percentage points implied for the end of the year compared to just 2 months ago. Other emerging markets were, like I said, already further ahead. So the Latin Americans were slightly further ahead, but nevertheless, even Mexico is showing a large increase in the implied policy rate at the end of the year. The Asians is the exception there. There we haven't seen as much need for increases, but nevertheless, even there, 50 to 100 basis points about increase in those countries. So monetary policy is catching up, but is it enough? And are they consequently avoiding a regime switch in which there may be a wage spiral developing? That is the question, the key question today. And we have, in that sense, not yet much to go on, because these wage spirals typically are only discovered ex post. But there are nevertheless a number of circumstances and institutional differences to compare with previous events. And what I'm showing you here is how the evolution was in the 1970s. That is often a comparison made because we have now again a large oil price shock, and the chart on the left gives you the perspective. But in relative terms, the oil price shock then in 1973 as well as in 1979 was much, much larger. In 73, prices from a base of 100, that's the numeraire here, increased to 250, so more than 200% increase. We saw that as well in 1979 in the blue line. Again, a large increase in the oil prices that we have not yet seen in this time around. So the increase has been large in nominal terms, but in relative terms, and correcting for inflation, it was much, much worse in the 70s than it is today. But that comparison ignores the fact that the rise in commodity prices this time around is much broader based than we saw in the 70s. This chart in the middle panel gives you the comparison of the energy price increases, the agriculture price increases, and the metals and mineral increases. And if you look at the different periods, so focusing on the yellow bar, you see that the yellow bar in some of these elements, in some of these categories, is actually quite high or even higher than we saw in the 70s, particularly in the metals and mineral, but even in the food prices, agricultural, it's coming close to the shock that we saw in the 70s. So there is a much more broad-based increase in prices this time around, in part because demand is still strong, but in part also because we have supply disruptions across the board, not just in the energy sector, but also in some of the other sectors. And lastly, if you make the comparisons again to the 70s, you want to control for the amount of oil production supply that Russia provides to the global economy in the 70s today, as opposed to what was taken off from the market in the 1970s. And here the Russian supply is about equivalent to 12% of world production. So that makes that comparison, if you look at the numbers here, where world production declines were in the order of -8 or -6% as a share of consumption or production. Those numbers are very large. So in other words, the oil embargo, if it were to take all the supply of Russia completely off the global market, we would have a large impact that would be equivalent to the 1970s. So we're having to worry here about the shocks in terms of magnitude. But then, of course, the response is also important to compare. And let me take you here to the monetary policy shock and the comparison to the 70s in the form of looking at the real policy rates. What was happening in the 1970s on the real rate is in the left-hand chart. And there what you see is that in the blue one is the 1979, the red is 1973, and yellow is where we are today. That in the earlier shock, the 73 shock, real policy rates were very negative for a long period of time. They actually fell and continued to fall after the shock occurred at time zero for a number of years. And before they finally recovered to being positive again, we were almost 3 years after the shock occurred. So nominal rates adjusted very slow, inflation was very high, and real rates were very low for long periods of time. 79 was different. 79 saw a quicker reaction in terms of nominal rates. They rose and real rates then increased eventually. They were positive, at least after a few years, and then went up to 3 percentage points in the end of the period after 3 years. Question is, where are we now today? If you look at the yellow category, this is advanced economies, where the range is the different countries. We see that real rates are actually quite low, historically almost very low, maybe even worse than we were in 73. So the yellow line as of today is in a very low spot. but they are expected to tighten. And this is what I showed you before in terms of nominal rates. That's starting to show up in real rates, but there's a lot of uncertainty here. So central banks have to act in order to go back to their real positive rates that will restrain demand sufficiently to avoid the wage spiral that we have seen before. So it is a tenuous balance that central banks have to do going forward. There's another difference. The chart on the right shows you the primary fiscal balance. The fiscal balance in the 70s was very moderate in the sense it didn't move much around. Both the blue and the red are more or less stable, with some decline in primary balances eventually. So a little bit more stimulus after a few years after the shock. Now compare that to the yellow. The yellow is the primary balance in the current situation and the projected balance going forward. And what we saw, of course, is that we had the COVID shock. So this is really the exception what we have seen now. The COVID shock had a large fiscal expansion, so the primary balance declined significantly. But now we see a large contraction again, at least a consolidation. So fiscally, there's going to be a drag that may, as a consequence, also help us on the inflation side. So from that sense, the 70s comparison is not the same. The monetary policy response will be faster, no doubt, and the primary fiscal response is also more contractionary. Let me finish on the financial markets. What have we seen there? A lot of volatility, of course. Stock prices moving around the left chart quite a bit. A sharp increase in the 10-year nominal rates, US, Europe, Japan to some extent as well. But nevertheless, not a large increase in corporate spreads. They're still at historical low levels. So the corporate side is still in a relatively good spot after this period, both in the US and in Europe, as well as in emerging markets. But financial conditions are tightening. So this is a comprehensive index that combines a number of financial indicators. And the lower the index, the tighter the financial conditions are. And you see that on the left chart, US and other advanced economies have been tightening considerably, but there's some correction recently. But euro area is not yet in that category. And emerging markets overall have been tightening quite a bit over this period, except for China. Why is this important? Well, important because we have a lot of debt at the moment. Debt, both public and private, is large. Asset prices are stretched. So for this tightening not to hurt the economy, overly slow down the economy, will be a balancing act going forward. So let me finish. The economy was slowing down. This was already there, but the war added a lot to the outlook to disrupt supply. The prospects for growth are waning. Commodity exporters may still be benefiting. But the main point here is that inflation is now really seeing another increase. The shocks have become not just larger, but also more persistent. So the tightening will have to happen to keep inflation at target. This is a challenging act. The comparison with the 1970s shows the difficulties that we had. The good part is that the markets, the financial markets, have been so far very well buffeted by the shocks and they're resilient. But as the conditioning tighten in the context of a large debt situations, the one thing we have to be very careful of is a snapback risk in which we may suddenly see an increase in rates that will surprise markets and lead to problems both for the financial stability as well as for the economy. Let me stop here and pass the floor back to you.
Thank you, Steen, for your insightful presentation. May I ask a few follow-up questions? In fact, as seen in your presentation, the inflation has been developing a little more benign in the region, and monetary policy responses have been a bit also slow in response. Do you see that the situation will change quickly. Like if you can even explain what has contributed to this modest inflation development in the region, that could also give the some ideas how the regions should, especially the monetary authorities, should look after when they are responding to the inflationary pressure in the coming months.
So no, thank you. And I think the difference across countries are important to keep in mind. And Asia stands out really as being less affected by those developments yet. I think it's a combination of not having had the shocks to the same degree. So both in the supply side, the shocks may have been less, but also it's the policy responses. And I'm here including policy responses across a broad set of actions, of course. So both the COVID is still somewhat more of a lingering concern in Asia that may have been holding back demand a little bit more than we've seen in the other parts of the world, where we suddenly see a rebound in demand, and that's been in some sense the trigger, or at least one of the triggers for the commodity price, for the price increases in many of the advanced economies at least. That we haven't seen to the same extent in Asia. And I think indeed also the history of having had low inflation for such a long period of time have given a lot of credibility to the central banks. I would combine that with the fact that historically, of course, the firms, including here Asia in a broad sense, have done quite a bit in terms of being competitive and absorbing shocks and not passing them on in terms of firm prices. And that has a lot to do with the manufacturing hub that Asia is for the whole world, where it's a very competitive structure, of course. And that has given another reason why we haven't seen that. Having said that, the shocks are large, so no doubt this is also going to come to some extent to Asia. There's no way around it. The PPIs are an indicator of that. So they have been flagging much more upward and red than the CPIs, for example. So you're going to see that same pressure coming sooner or later. But no, nevertheless, they don't have to act as strong and as rapid as some of the other countries have been doing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, Asia relies heavily on the oil imports, especially given the situations of the geopolitical the tension and then the still continuing the war. Do you expect the the concerns of the stagflation be realized? How should the region actually respond to that?
I mean, stagflation is maybe a less concern, but the first region that will have to worry about it most is Europe, because the supply shocks are large, the energy imports, besides the price effect, also have a quality component of it. So not having energy in the first place, of course, is going to make a serious constraint on growth. So I think that issue and that risk more there. And also there's combined with some more demographics and other trends that make maybe you're more vulnerable to that risk. I think the stagflation risk in Asia is not that large, not as large, let's put it this way. And responses on the fiscal side, there is a little bit more room as well to compensate for some of these shocks. I'm not generalizing here because there's large differences, including between emerging, developing, advanced countries in terms of debt stocks. But on the whole, there's probably a little bit more room to do that. Having said that, I think the one vulnerability that we have noticed on the private side is the external indebtedness of the corporate sector. And that is, in some countries, quite significant. So that will be more than a function of the global monetary tightening that will affect some of these countries, and as a consequence can create issues going forward.
Thank you. Well, this will be my last question for you. There has been some concerns about the widening income inequality during the COVID, and some do point to that the unprecedented monetary policy expansion might have some implications for the economic and the income and then wealth inequality. What would be your thoughts on that?
We analyze monetary policy from a longer structural point of view, and because the impact on the short-run inequality is there. And of course, then the monetary policy responses always have to consider, on one hand, the financial effect, but also then at the same time the economic effect through increased labor outcomes and more general economic growth. So I think at the margin, monetary policies then is most important for keeping prices stable. And so I would think of going forward, at least, that is the main income inequality channel that we have to keep in mind as being important. Inflation is a regressive tax in that sense. And if we don't control that, then we could see a worsening. Having this history and inflation of inequality in the last 2 years, of course, is a quite unusual one, because at least in many countries, we've seen large fiscal support going to both the middle, but also to the lower income segment of society. So in some sense, we've compensated more than adequate for the shock in a relative sense. So inequality is, in that sense, is not increasing. So I think this is more the forward-looking challenge of how we can keep inflation under control and that way support an equal distribution of income.
Thank you very much. Thank you also finally for answering all these questions. I'll stop pestering you. Let me now introduce our distinguished panels. First, let me introduce Dr. Fabrizio Caribu. He is head of macroeconomic finance research in the Institute for Economic and Social Research in the Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia since 2015. He's also head of Fiscal Policy Agency in the Ministry of Finance in the Republic of Indonesia. His expertise covers economics and business projection, economic models, financial economics, monetary economics, and public policy analysis. He has obtained a bachelor's in economics from the University of Indonesia, a master in international and development economics from Australian National University, and a PhD from the University of Kansas. We also have the honor of having Professor Hai-Hong Gao, who is the Director of Research Center for International Finance, Institute of World Economics and Politics on the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She is lead fellow of CSIS Project China and International Financial System, Standing Council Director of China Society of World Economy and China Society for Finance and Banking. She is served as co-chairs of the T20 Task Force on International Finance and was appointed as chief economist of Network of East Asian Think Tanks, China Working Group. Her academic publications include papers and books in the field of international monetary system, regional financial cooperation, and the Chinese economy. We also have Dr. Dennis Hu, who is the director of APAC Policy Support Unit. He was regional cooperation specialist at the Asian Development Bank before taking up his current appointment at APAC. From 2001 to 2008, Dr. Hu was Senior Fellow and Program Coordinator at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore. He was also Managing Editor of the ASEAN Economic Bulletin, a leading academic journal that focuses on economic issues in Southeast Asia. He has written extensively on regional economic integration and cooperation, especially about ASEAN and the Asia-Pacific region. Dennis holds Bachelor of Science in Economics from the University of Warwick, United Kingdom, and also Master's and PhD in Finance from the University of Manchester in United Kingdom. Last but not least, we have Dr. Alicia Garcia Herrero. She's a adjunct professor at the Hong Kong University of Science Technology, as well as a senior fellow at Brussels-based economic think tank Bruegel, and non-resident research fellow at Madrid Madrid-based political think tank Real Instituto Elcano. She is also chief economist for Asia Pacific and Netflix, based in Hong Kong, China. Alicia is also a member of Council of the Advisor of the Hong Kong Institute for Monetary Research and member of the board of the Hong Kong Forum and co-founder of Bring Hong Kong. Previous positions she held include Chief Economist for Emerging Markets at BBVA, member of the Asia Research Program at the Bank of International Settlements, Head of International Economy Division of the Bank of Spain, member of the Council to the Executive Board of the European Central Bank, Head of Emerging Economies at the Research Department of Banco Santander, and economist at IMF. She is always combining her career in the private and the public sector with the commitment to apply the research and teaching. She holds a PhD in economics from George Washington University and also widely published in refereed journals and books. So let me go to Fabio. First, you might like to give the brief sort of opening statement that you have, potentially explaining the G20 agenda for economic recovery in the context of the current macroeconomic development.
Thank you, Chin Young. Thank you, Steen, for very insightful presentation about where the economy globally at the moment. If you don't mind, I would like to update everybody a little bit about how G20 agenda, and we just finished the second FMCBG back in DC last week. Clearly on the context of global economic recovery, this is quite challenging now. We see that the recovery is expected, like before, to be asynchronous. Partly due to uneven access, delivery, and uptake of the vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostic, and also increased likelihood of narrower and uneven macroeconomic policy space. We had seen, started from the beginning of the year, supply disruptions, supply-demand mismatches, pent-up demand, and an increased commodity prices, including energy and food prices. Also, these are all contributing to inflationary pressures in a number of countries and pose potential risk to global economic outlook. Now, with the war in Ukraine, this has made the global challenges become more complex. Geopolitical crisis has added to the global challenges that have been and are still being faced before, which is handling the pandemic itself, global health issues, and now we have high debt in poor and vulnerable countries, and also still we are facing climate change mitigation and adaptation risk. Geopolitical crisis clearly will also weaken efforts to recover the global economy. Now, in this context, G20 continue to use all of the available policy tools for each country, especially advanced and also developing countries involved in G20, to address the impacts of the pandemic, particularly in those most impacted, such as women, youth, and informal and low-skilled workers, and also on inequalities. The G20 reaffirmed our commitment to advancing the forward-looking agenda set in the G20 action plan and progressing the 2030 agenda for sustainable development for achieving the stronger, greener, and more balanced global development. But clearly, this has to be very cautious now, especially with the withdrawal. G20 need to adjust target policy support as appropriate. As G20 countries, economic recoveries still continue, but G20 need to preserve financial stability, fiscal sustainability, and also still safeguarding against downside risk and negative spillover. Now, we need to, based on the last communique back in Jakarta in February, we mentioned that we need to support collective ambition to recover together, recover stronger, but this is now clearly getting more challenging, but we still confirming that our commitment for a well-calibrated, well-planned, and well-communicated exit strategies to support recovery. Clearly, this is again more challenging now. Inflations, like Professor Steen mentioned, are currently elevated in many countries. Central bank will need to act where necessary to ensure price stability in line with their respective mandates, while remaining committed to clear communication of their policy stances for us to be able to minimize the negative impact or spillover impact to especially the emerging economies. Now, in dealing with the geopolitical crisis, as G20 presidency, Indonesia will always maintain dialogue because, again, G20 is built upon a consensus and as much as possible to reach consensus on issues that are critically important for global economy stability and prosperity. We are doing dozens of consultations with members to find best approach in navigating the impact of the war and also on current geopolitical crisis.
Thank you, Fabio. May I now turn to Dr. Gao. Dr. Gao, can you give us some updates on the recovery prospects and then macro challenges in China, given the recent surge and again the prolonged lockdown?
Right. Thank you. I'm so glad to see some old friends and new friends here. Yes, I'm going to focus on Chinese economy, give you a little bit update in 5 minutes. The Chinese economy faces another downturn after a quick rebound in the first year of the pandemic and a strong growth last year. And the growth target was set at 5.5% for this year. But some believe this is probably a ceiling given the number of downside pressures. The fixing investment picked up, but consumption actually is extremely low. This is due to a number of factors like, the rising savings, the lockdown effect, and of course, a lower household income that is affected by the decline of labor forces in service sector. And on a policy front, stimulating the economy should be the priority for the policymakers, but the recent lockdown added more hurdles. Now the government actually has to take a balance act between the lockdown measures and the policies to keep the economy going. Well, the fiscal policy basically has been prudent due to the concern of debt accumulation. And the monetary policy actually also took a balance act between, stimulus and of course the buildup of leverage. But lately, I think the central bank actually took more measures to, relax the policy by lowering interest rate and also reduce the credit for the firms. And I think basically we are hoping for more stimulus coming because, currently there is no hope of this sort of strict measures of the lockdown without any further stimulus coming to boost the economy. And another concern is the diverging monetary policy between China and the US. China and the US basically in the different cycle since the beginning of the pandemic. And now actually the narrowed interest rate differentials resulted in a currency depreciation and accelerated capital flow. Although the size is still very limited, but someone's worried that because of the expectation, the trend will continue, and the risk attached to that could be a concern if the central bank is starting to worry about the negative impact. Of course, the central bank, the PBOC, has a set of macroprudential policies, to manage capital flows in case it's too volatile, and also the flexible exchange rate. I mean, is still a favorable tool for China. As a large economy, the central bank really want to have the independence of the monetary policy to focus more on domestic objective. But that said, I think the central bank cannot leave the exchange rate freely flow. there is some possibilities, they intervene if the movement is too beyond the reasonable range. And in the longer term, I think China faces a number of challenges like aging and the factor market reform. And in particular, I want to point it out, because of the pandemic, actually, the structural transformation will be delayed. You see that all these stimulus policies are directed to boost the supply side of the economy, which means that the past effort of the sort of rebalancing actually will need more time to be back on track. So very quick.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gao. I think Dr. Gao already brought up very important issues about steering an inclusive recovery. Dennis, I understand that the APAC Policy Support Unit has done really a lot of interesting studies on the COVID impact on jobs and poverty and also the inequality. So what will be the APAC sort of initiatives or areas where you particularly encourage the APAC policymakers to address to ensure the recovery becomes more inclusive?
Yeah, thanks, Xing-Yong, for having me here to speak a little bit about what's been going on in APAC. And we, in about less than a couple of weeks' time, will be in Bangkok to attend the APAC SOM2 and Trade Ministers meeting. And we will be also launching our APAC Regional Trends Analysis Report, which will talk a little bit about the outlook and some of the challenges being faced by the APAC region. So in terms of forecast, like ADB, IMF, we all had to revise our forecast, GB forecast downwards. Certainly for this year, we're looking at about 3.2% for the APAC region and 3.4% in 2023. And that's a reduction of about 1% this year and 0.4% in next year. Many of the downside risks to that recovery is very similar to what the other speakers have talked about. And essentially, bottom line is that recovery is going to take a lot longer than expected, partly because of many of these unexpected events that's happened this year, not just recovering from the pandemic, but we've got the Ukraine conflict as well as some of the effects or consequences from that. But certainly, of course, everyone's talked a lot about inflation, and in APAC itself, average inflation has doubled from, I think it was 3% last year, it was 1.5% in 2020. Last 2 months of last year was about 4%, and certainly this year's forecast, which we will be working on, will be significantly higher than last year. And that has a huge impact on some of the poverty numbers that we will be projecting as well. Certainly, if you look at what the World Bank has looked at in 2020, more than 100 million additional people have fallen into poverty because of the pandemic. And with these factors like the conflict, rising food prices, commodity prices, these are aggravating some of these existing poverty numbers, and with the possibly additional 75 to 91 million additional people falling into poverty globally. The other thing that we need to look at is also supply chain disruptions. We talked a lot about that. In fact, Xing-Yong and I have had a lot of discussions on supply chain disruptions, partly due to the supply chain bottlenecks that we see in different parts of Asia. And that has led to rising shipping costs and other transportation costs. Again, it's how long can companies not pass on that to the end consumer? So you will see higher prices, or you're beginning to see it already. Certainly in Singapore, we're beginning to see it, higher consumer prices because of these increase in transportation costs due to supply chain disruptions. Again, that will be another area of concern. The engines of growth for the APAC region is China, the US, and we know that, as Dr. Gao said, that China's growth is moderating. I think she mentioned 5.5% this year, which perhaps would be a bit on the optimistic side. I think some of the market expectations is between 4.5 to 5%. And that would of course, have an impact on many of the economies because of the global value chains and how they're all linked to China, and particularly in the manufacturing sector. So these will also have a concern. I think another important thing to stress is that in our report, and we talked about that, is that even as we see these recovery numbers, it does mask very uneven growth rates in individual APAC economies. And that is because of the different levels of pandemic management, how they manage the pandemic, the level of vaccine coverage as well as to whether they have the fiscal space to support businesses and households. So those who are able to do that are able to recover a lot faster. And I think that's quite important because we talked about it last year, but it's still important this year that there is still a very significant vaccine divide all over the world, including the APAC region. I think the latest numbers is about 55% globally have been fully vaccinated, 62% with at least one dose. But in low-income economies, it's still 10 to 11%. And as long as we have this growing divide among those who are vaccinated, and also the capacity to vaccinate, we need to have enough healthcare workers and medical professionals to provide that inoculations to the general population. Then there are rising concerns of virus mutations like Omicron, who knows, and other potential variants of COVID-19 that may occur. So I think those are some of the concerns that needs to be stressed as we move ahead. I think in terms of the immediate term, I think one of the key things that policymakers in the APAC region will be looking at is for economies to recover and rebuild and to reopen, is to look at issues like bringing down tariffs, particularly for medical supplies, as well as supporting and facilitating movements of essential workers, particularly in the healthcare sector. Looking at things like addressing concerns of vaccine hesitancy. So even if the vaccines are available, the concerns, of course, is whether populations will accept these vaccines. So again, trying to address misinformation out there, whether it's in social media and others, will be important. In the longer term, APAC does have a new vision. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. It's called the Putrajaya Vision 2040. That was launched in Malaysia in 2020, and last year in New Zealand they had the Altera Plan of Action to implement that 20-year action plan. That 20-year vision, and there will be various aspects that look at not just on trade and investment, which is kind of our bread and butter in APAC, but to look at issues like sustainability as well as supporting digitalization and innovation. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis. Well, hold that thought. We're going back to the sustainability very soon. Well, Alicia, even as the inflation in the region has been relatively modest compared to other regions, in fact, the U.S. interest rate hikes in response to the inflation there will have a significant implication already in the region. What will be the areas the region's policymakers should really watch out for when the inflation as well as the high sort of commodity prices and then the potential risk of the capital flows? What will be your advice for the policymakers?
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share views with all of you. I've learned a lot so far, and I hope I can contribute. Now it's my turn to pay the price to be here, and I try to make some interesting comments, although it'll be hard because I'm the last. To respond to your question, we've actually conducted some empirical analysis, simple VAR, just to look at what may happen with interest rates in the region. And I have to say that it looks as if central banks so far have been a little bit slow in, and I can understand that because we were all slow in realizing what was coming from the Fed. Yeah, I mean, it's not really only central banks, it's market analysts, let alone investors. But that surprise in Fed is going to really push interest rates much higher in the region. And this is also because we're in the midst of sell-off, basically, of EM. So we have a number of reasons for this. One is China COVID policy, and the other one is also the fear of secondary sanctions. And this is not only China; it could be elsewhere. Yeah, as long as potential. It could be inadvertence. It doesn't have to be necessarily a decision happens. There is, of course, this additional risk. But beyond that, what is really important to realize in terms of these capital outflows that will push interest rates further up beyond what would be required just because the Fed is tightening. We also have to think of potential events, and the most obvious one is Sri Lanka at the moment in the region, followed by Pakistan. So because of all of these regions, what our analysis shows is, rates of the order of 10% in Indonesia, nearly 6% in Thailand. It's pretty aggressive. And I think, I don't know whether these are the rates we will see, but what I'm trying to say here is that the shock is coming. And as if this were not enough, I do think that this time around, and I agree with Steen on the fact that inflation 2021 was a Western world story. I think 2022 is going to be an Asian story. Why? First, the share of food in the CPI index. If you look at Indonesia, if you look at, actually Philippines is higher, even India. It's just obviously going to hit CPI baskets in these countries. The other one, I think, is that supply bottlenecks coming from COVID in China eventually are going to reverberate in the regional supply chain as well. The previous experience was one in which China was exporting at full wind. The rest of the world was shut down. But this time around is very different. It's more of a I think the impact is going to be more regional than global, and that's going to further push up inflationary pressures. The other one was already mentioned. The region is dependent on energy and dependent on metals, except for Australia, and that in itself may, create additional pressures. And to add a positive into a negative, and not to, I'll try to end on a more positive note, but I'm still struggling with this idea that is good for China, that we had President Xi announcing this big infra binge. But the reality of things is that this is going to be a credit-led infrastructure stimulus. And that is inflationary in nature. So for many, many reasons, I think we're going to have a second half of a year that is going to look more inflationary than probably we're even expecting. And plus the Fed. So I think central banks in the region will be busy. And I just hope that they are busy before they need to be busy. In other words, that they do not fall behind the curve. Because if they do, they'll have to do much more than it would have been required otherwise. So that's basically my message on the Fed. To end on a positive, of course, the infra binge, if I call it that way, because we've estimated how much infrastructure investment China will need to reach a 5% growth, slightly below target, but I think 5% to me would sound quite good already, and that's 18% year on year. So it's humongous. It's just to give you a sense of dimension. 2018-19 hovers around 1 to 3%. So, it's just very, very, by the way, already the first quarter was very good in infrastructure investment, which is, as Haihon said, the good thing about China in the first quarter is fixed asset investment is back, and it's back in real estate, manufacturing investment was good, and infrastructure investment turned the page. But it has to turn the page 3 times as much in the remaining of the year to get to that target through infrastructure investment. If you think of lockdowns, of course, it makes it even harder. And I wish China well. I'm sure there will be other things that China might do other than only infrastructure investment to get there. Because I think if it's only infrastructure investment, it's going to be very difficult. So I do hope there is some plan on consumption, or something that in a way distributes the burden, if I may say, of that to get to that growth target. But imagine, and this is to end the final positive for the region at the end of the day, is that if that infra-led stimulus happens, which as I said is very difficult, it's a very demanding amount of infra that we need, that's a boom. I mean, it's again a boom. I mean, so we may say it's bad for inflation, but I think growth-wise, it might actually bring some benefit, especially for those exporting inputs to infrastructure. So you can think of iron ore, you can think of all kinds of metals. So that's the positive, to find something to add at the very end. I was trying very hard to end on a positive note. So that's all from my side.
Thank you, Alicia. Well, let us talk a little bit about the long-term challenges. And then since we waited actually in the first round until the end, let me just give you the floor for the first the speaker in the second round. You actually talked about this importance of the infrastructure for growth, and then I think that it's a long run. Like, we do want to promote green investment. What would be the policy role to promote this sustainable finance green investment? But please keep your remark a bit short, because we're running out of time, and then we want to hear from everyone.
Now, rather than positive, I'm going to be blunt and clear, if I may. This year is a humongously difficult year for Asia because of 3 shocks: Fed, Ukraine, and China COVID. And what I see in the data, and this includes everybody, including developed Asia, including South Korea, this is not the year of climate change. And, this is not the year, in the sense that we are seeing increase in coal production, we're seeing targets being lifted. And in a way, I can understand that, because it's a very difficult year. So I understand we want green infrastructure, and I hope that will be the case. But my sense, to be very frank, is that countries, and I'm talking about China in this particular case, but it's a general statement, will try to find easy, quick adjustments, because the unsurmountable risks that we're seeing. And let's not forget, we even have inflation on the table, and central banks needing to be much harsher. So in the light of that, I'm not expecting a lot on this front, but I do expect governments to think about it and push much further medium term. So in other words, plan ahead and make sure that these targets remain and are worked out. But I don't think it will be kind of the main theme this year, if I may.
Thank you, Alicia. So Dennis, you were going to talk about the sustainable development, environmental sustainable. What are the APEC initiatives on the environmental sustainability, climate change, and how the trade and an investment negotiation can actually support these initiatives? Dennis, can you unmute yourself? You seem to be muted.
Sorry, I tend to agree with Alicia too. It's going to be difficult to talk about climate change this year, given the kind of challenges that we have. But having said that, it's important to note that, in the APEC region, over 70% of natural disasters happen in this part of the world. Many of them is caused by climate change. So we are exposed to some of these adverse effects from climate change, but we also do contribute to it, unfortunately. Some of the statistics that we have is greenhouse gas emissions, we've increased that from 16.5 to 27.8 gigatons of CO2. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to address greenhouse gases and to also to commit to the Paris Agreement. I think in terms of initiatives, this year Thailand is hosting APEC, and they've introduced something called the Bangkok Goals on the bio, green, and circular economy. So they are trying to get APEC members to discuss some of the best practices out there, particularly with regards to, I would say, the circular economy. So in a way, that's the contribution that they can make towards addressing some of the challenges from climate change. And it's the same issue, right? It's a lot of it is commitments, but we've got to find some ways to put that into action. So I think that's quite crucial for the discussions this year. The other thing, of course, in terms of trade is, of course, we have brought down, we have a list of environmental goods that's been brought down, about 54 of them that was agreed way back in 2012. And we continue to negotiate and looking at ways that we can bring down barriers to goods which are identified as either environmental goods or environmental services. But that's still kind of a work in progress. So again, we're doing what we can on our side.
Thank you, Dr. Gao. Even as China trying to maintain more moderate growth, I know the Chinese government has been really placing strong emphasis now, inclusive growth. Recently introduced the national pensions plan. And do you have any, expectations of how these things going to work? Like, will it actually help reduce poverty and address the income inequality as the government, expects?
Right. Yes, you mentioned the reform of the pension system recently. This is really a good news because this topic has been discussed for many, many years. And we've been through many issues because China is facing a aging problem, and of course there is a big challenge of this large number of migrant workers, and this sort of current system cannot cover. It's just a very limited capacity to do that. So this is something, it's a big game changer, not only for the whole pension system, but also, you mentioned about inclusive because, the coverage is much broader with this private pension themes. So this is something, it's like compensate to the old age state providing the pension system as well as the firm level. So we call this 3 pillars. So it's a sort of complete a structure of this whole system. And another hope is that because I talk more about this the structure issues because the demand side story is just we realize it's so weak, but we can't do anything, and with this reform, there could be something, happening because, they can release sort of a savings from the household. Normally, the Chinese like to save a lot because of this lack of protection. But with this new reform, they will, maybe happy to spend more in the future. And of course, for financial market, many the investors hope that because this new private pension will be invested in a direct financing market, which is apart from the banking sector. So capital market will benefit from this new thing. So there are a lot of hopes, but still it's just an initial stage. We just keep an eye on it.
Thank you, Dr. Gao. Well, Fabio, I know the G20 is also working a lot on the sustainable finance, and then Indonesia really puts the sustainable finance and then investment as a priority for recovery and then future growth as well. Can you share the Indonesian strategies and also the plans to promote the sustainable finance?
Yes. Actually, at G20 and also in addition to G20, also G7, even this year, amid the war in Ukraine and all of the energy prices going up and everything, the push for the agenda of sustainable finance and also more specifically on transition finance is actually getting even stronger. So this is a very encouraging dialogue and collaborations that's been going on, not only within the G20 itself, between the advanced countries and developing countries, but also very strongly from the G7 countries. Especially since everybody understands Europe has been hit a lot with these high energy prices. So to Germany, for example, it is even more imperative for them to speed up the transition from fossil fuel to greener energy. And this has been a very good development in G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And this is co-chaired, by the way, for information, this is co-chaired by Chinese and the US, the sustainable finance. This is very encouraging to see how countries, both advanced countries and emerging countries, are now getting around this idea of transitioning very strongly, even in this situation, and actually even more push for direction to that direction. Now, on Indonesia, we know that we have coal, and 68% of our electricity is actually from coal. And a lot of countries in Asia are actually having similar situation as well. In some other countries, the situation is probably a little bit different. But again, the transition from fossil fuel to greener energy is imperative, not only in the long run, not only in the medium term, actually speeding up starting from today. So we are developing consensus in G20 and also G7. In G20, we're talking about transition finance, but also we're also looking at the options of country platform as to how country platform can actually help rallying all of the supports and mobilizing funds when we talk about the taxonomy of sustainable finance. And now we are more direct into transition finance, since everybody actually facing the transition problems. In G7, they are also talking about transition finance, and they're also talking about the country platform as well. So it is very encouraging to see a lot of consensus been developing, and we are looking at mobilizing more capital market funds into projects, not only talking about the top idea about how we made our Paris Agreement national determined contribution by 2030, commitment for net zero 2050, 2060, depends on the countries, but also in trying how to mobilize the funds to do the transition for economies, both in G20 context and also the G7 context. These are all very encouraging, and we would like to push this forward.
Thank you very much. Well, this wasn't planned, but I would like to actually invite Steen. I know that the BIS has done quite a bit of work also on sustainable finance. If you can share your quick sort of like a comments or remark in just 1 minute.
No, thank you. And I think sustainable finance, obviously, this is a difficult year to make big projects to finance them and get them going. But there's a huge agenda in terms of, and it was already alluded to, in terms of taxonomies and making the information available such that the financial sector can most productively help in this agenda. And I think the financial sector is stepping forward now. You see many private sector initiatives that are willing to do that, but there's too many uncertainty yet, and information isn't there yet. If we can make that happen this year, that we have these taxonomies agreed globally, and then on that basis go forward. And now that has to be complemented, of course, with the real sector too, giving the right signals. Where do we want the improvements to come from? The financial sector on its own can help, but can't lead in that sense. So there's an agenda there that can move regardless, I would think. I do want to also reflect a little bit on the growth agenda more generally. Obviously, this is a time when we have to be even more cognizant that we don't want to fall into a trap of deglobalization. We want to reinforce the open system that has benefited us so much. So there's a big agenda just to preserve what we have. There's a lot of pressure going the other way. And I think on the structural side, we don't often talk about it, but there is a lot still to be done. I mean, it depends obviously on country by country, but whether it's labor force participation rates that are still not as high as one would like it to be for all the genders and all the parts of society, or what is on the business climate. I mean, many of these things don't necessarily cost money, they cost political capital. But maybe in this time when there are so many shocks coming to us, we have a little bit more of an opportunity. Well, wait, we really need to move on some of these issues. Because I think in the end, growth is really what will get us out of this difficult period for the next year or so. So I would want to stress that agenda as well.
Thank you. Well, I don't want to summarize all this rich discussion, but I think we all understand the the challenges, and then also coming with the new opportunities. I do hope that the regional policymakers and then G20 got enough food for thought to consider what would be the better way of balancing these challenges and still steer us on the path to inclusive and sustainable recovery. Thank you very much for all your thoughts, and I would like to adjourn this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sin-Young Park and the honorable speakers for the session. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have a short 5-minute break, so we'll see you again shortly after the break. Thank you very much.
In 2008, an international research organization was founded that would seek to have a positive influence on relationships and policymaking within and between the countries of ASEAN and East Asia. This is AREA, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia.
When AREA was first mooted, the thinking was we need a very substantial economic research body.
It's very important for an organization like ASEAN to have the backing academically for what it wants to do. And that's why AREA fills in the gap and helps provide the research.
It's more about providing the information that's needed for the negotiators or for the political decision makers.
We are not a pure academic institution. We must do the more practical policy recommendation.
And AREA's role, of course, is also to promote the talking through of sensible policy developments, and it plays a fundamentally important role in that respect.
And AREA is now accepted as one of the major research institutes in East Asia as a whole.
After its first decade of input into the development of ASEAN, AREA must now be ready to meet the challenges of the future.
We believe that issues like sustainable development, like environment, issues like education, humanitarian aspect of it, which we think AREA has the capacity to develop expertise and provide policy recommendation to ASEAN.
AREA, hopefully in the not too distant future, will become like the OECDs of our region.
AREA will continue to contribute to the community building of ASEAN and East Asia.
The COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on lives, well-being, and economies in Asia and the Pacific, along with the rest of the world. Since the beginning of the pandemic at the start of 2020, ADB has committed more than $17.5 billion to help its developing member countries address the impacts of COVID-19 and address vaccination needs, and has mobilized a further $12.5 billion in co-financing from partners. From the earliest stages, ADB offered technical assistance to address Asia and the Pacific's most pressing needs, including medical equipment and supplies, improving laboratories, and training frontline workers. To mitigate the immediate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, ADB committed $10.2 billion to support governments' counter-cyclical expenditure programs in 26 countries. Some $501.7 million has been helping private companies provide medical equipment and essential services. And ADB committed $3.2 billion for trade finance, supply chain finance, and microfinance programs. ADB is also providing crucial knowledge to help countries better tackle the pandemic and shape a greener recovery. This includes databases on policy measures, supply chains, and economic impacts. As the world kickstarts a sustainable recovery from COVID-19, ADB is delivering comprehensive support to meet Asia and the Pacific's vaccine needs. Through a $9 billion Asia-Pacific Vaccine Access Facility, or APVAX, announced in December 2020, ADB is providing funding for vaccine procurement, logistics, and distribution. The initiative also supports important investments to build capacity in vaccine delivery, community outreach, and surveillance. Throughout its COVID-19 response operations, ADB is working closely with partners, including other international financial institutions, bilateral institutions, and the UN system. ADB is adapting with agility to the region's changing circumstances, working together with its developing member countries to rebuild for a long-lasting recovery.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Our fourth and last session of the day, entitled Reviving Trade, Investment, and Connectivity, will look into ways to address the key challenges in the near-term recovery process. Moderating this session will be Professor Fukunari Kimura, Chief Economist of the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Professor Fukunari Kimura has been Chief Economist at ERIA since 2008. He has been a professor at the Faculty of Economics of Keio University in Japan since 2000. Professor Fukunari Kimura holds a PhD from the Department of Economics, University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1991. He majors in international trade and development economics and has been active in academic writing on production networks, economic integration, and the digital economy in East Asia. We kindly invite our participants to post questions and/or comments during the Q&A session. For the audience attending here at the venue, please provide your questions to any of our organizers, which they will pass along to our moderator. For the virtual attendants, please write your question at the Zoom Q&A box or YouTube comment section. I kindly suggest to keep your questions short and straightforward. Don't forget to inform us of your name, your affiliation, and the speakers whom you would like to address your question, if any. Without further ado, may I please welcome Professor Fukunari Kimura to chair the session. Professor, you may have the screen.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to the session. I think that the old program shows that Secretary General of the WTO could provide some opening remarks, but so she didn't come. She doesn't come this time, unfortunately. But we still have a very good panelists here. So hopefully hopefully we would make some constructive inputs to the G20. The title of the session is Reviving Trade, Investment and Connectivity. Certainly, I myself is having some sort of bias toward the local news sources, but now in my judgment that trade, investment, and connectivity are in a really difficult situation in the world. Certainly, country by country, the situation is different, but in G20, somehow, if we can convey some positive messages on our belief in trade, investment, and connectivity, and also globalization forces for economic development. To me, I think we are facing 4 challenges, or at least 4 points related to supply chains right now. One is COVID-19. Still, COVID-19 is hanging around some countries, and also in the recovering process is really trials and errors right now. So that's one thing that we have to talk about. And then geopolitical tensions. So in Northeast Asia is the region, particularly for having geographical tensions all the way. But after the Russia-Ukraine war started, so that atmosphere in G7 changed very drastically. And so we are having much more talk on say, a controlled, managed trade and investment rather than freer trade and vigorous economy. So how, and also the logic of national security is very strong in a sense. They do not have a sort of a sense of balance sometimes between national security issues and economic efficiency. So how we can set up sort of like the rule-based trading regime, even if a part of the economies are going to be some sort of a managed trade or investment. I think that's a big challenge right now. And also the third point is digital technology. Certainly, both developed countries and developing countries are accelerating the adaptation of digital technology, and that trend is accelerated by COVID-19 too. And we can see some good signs for developing countries too. The digitalized services trade is increasing, and also the overall digital transformation is penetrating into the local economy too. So. But at the same time, some people are still worrying about the future of production networks, for example. So after having a digital technology, what could be the pattern of international division of labor, and also so going to much more fragmented, much more sophisticated international division of labor, beyond task by task division of labor to person division of labor. Certainly, we need various kinds of transformation of our economy and society, particularly for developing countries. The last point is environmental concern. That kind of concern is relatively slow and weak in Asia, but in Europe and other places, actually the COVID-19 accelerated those kind of discussion. Then many countries in Asia particularly is still using a lot of fossil fuels. We really need a really concrete and feasible scenario for going to the low carbon economy. And also some trade issues are coming in related to environmental concern too. EU is taking a really active move for introducing carbon border adjustment mechanism and others, and how developing countries and G20 would respond to that. That is probably another issue that we have to take care of. So trade and investment and connectivity, in my current judgment, I think we have a bunch of difficulties rather than really 100% optimism like we had several years ago. So today we will have 4 panelists in addition to me, and they are really renowned researchers and bureaucrats and private person. I think hopefully that we can pick up some positive messages that still trade and investment and connectivity are important for economic development, and then G20 should deliver that kind of messages from a viewpoint. So first, I'd like to go one by one to panelists and making an opening speech. So I'd like to start from Mia Mikic. Mia is a trade economist. She's a board member of the Friends of Multilateralism Group and of the Board of Advisors for the Trade Policy Research Forum. She was a director Trade Investment and Innovation Division in United Nations, SCAP, and prior to her 16-year UN tenure, during 2001 to 2005, she was head of the Department of Economic Theory, professor of international economics, and the director of Economic and Business International Program at the University of Zagreb, and senior lecturer at the University of Auckland, 1988 to 2005. So Mia, could you start out and giving some brief speech first? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fuku. I always feel very uncomfortable with such long and kind interventions. So thank you for, giving perhaps more time than necessary to this. And before I start, of course, I'm thanking all the organizers and of course yourself as a moderator and the co-panelists for this opportunity to engage this very important topic. And so, as you said in the opening sort of remarks, we should reflect on the theme of this session, which is reviving trade, investment, and connectivity in the global context. But of course, we are all interested and live in the region, so it's impossible to ignore perhaps some differences between global and regional things. But let me start at the obvious point, and you have also alluded to that, and I think previous speakers have also made some comments on that, is that for trade, investment, and connectivity to function in a seamless, frictionless way, there are many ingredients that need to conflate, but there is one element that is very, very important, which is the willingness of governments of countries to actually talk to each other and to stick to the agreed rules. And so I think in recent past, and particularly now acutely with the war, we have reduced willingness of countries to engage with each other across the board, and they are more inclined to sort of focus on conversations with the sort of like-minded or within the smaller groups, as often the G of the WTO mentioned. But anyway, this trust, this erosion of trust actually is not happened only this year. It's ongoing process, and I think we are all painfully aware, particularly to the pandemic, that we have lost quite a bit of resources and human lives because of that. So when we talk about revival, we have to, and we are talking, the premise here is revival from the shocks of the pandemic, but also the shock the pandemic came on the quite a strong swing of the trade tensions, and now it is of course made even worse through this concrete hot war, but also deepening of the Cold War in terms of impacts of sanctions and impacts of the tensions and the break in terms of the production and trade, particularly in the sectors of energy and food. So all of this needs to be taken into account. It's a very complex situation, and I don't envy anyone who is working on any sort of forecasts or predictions. I have, for the benefit of introducing some thoughts in this session, I have looked at the most recently issued updates on the various outlooks from the institutions that normally do that, in Washington, in Geneva, in Manila, etc. And so everyone without a fail have actually downgraded the forecasts for the global economic growth by about 1 percentage point. So we are now looking at the range between 2.6 to 2.8 for 2022, which is low based on already slowed growth and somewhat present recovery, but uneven recovery in 2021. And so obviously this slowdown in GDP being and economic growth being the major fuel for trade is going to play a role in how we look at the trade trends in this year and the next year. And so the most recent WTO forecast is basically targeting this growth in terms of trade merchandise trade volume at around 3%, but giving a very wide margin of from 0.5 to 5.5, depends on how various scenarios, most importantly related to the war, but also some other elements, including the trade costs and inflation, etc., will play out. So I think this forecast in terms of trade is also driven by a very persistent increase in uncertainty in terms of economic policy making and in terms, of course, of geopolitics. And so investment, since the biggest enemy of investment is uncertainty, is also now in a straitjacket. And while we had some recovery, particularly for Asia at the end of last year, now this has gone through the window. And I hope we can discuss a little bit more in the session about what are the drivers of investment and how the private sector sees it as compared to perhaps governments, etc. And then lastly, of course, the demand, which has been playing a huge factor in global economy since the global financial crisis, if we look only on this century, and then, of course, in the pandemic, and now in the because of the increase in the inflation, in interest rates and the reduction of government's willingness to, give more stimulus through the social protection, we will probably see reduced demand, and so that may be fortunate because if it softens enough, we will have maybe an impact on a reduction of trade costs that also had the sort of a maximum late last year and early this year, but then there are different factors also playing into this, starting with energy prices, etc. So this is about the numbers, and I think one keyword that is describing the numbers is uncertainty. So we really don't know much. And very quickly, because I know my time is up, I want to just give a couple of sentences about other two keywords that you mentioned as well, Foucault. And one is related to this trust and or the lack of the trust, which is very important for the institutional side of trade. Finally, the dates for the ministerial conference 12 have been reconfirmed for 12th to 15th of June. And so we, while we know the dates, we still don't know in what form, in what shape the governments will be working with each other, given that that very, the atmosphere, as you said, of reduced trust. But the last keyword is, I think, is urgency. And it's urgency to actually see or to give the really due attention to the fact that trade, investment, and connectivity are not the end goal in themselves. They need to deliver better lives, a higher standard of living, and definitely, more social sort of justice in terms of better inclusivity and environmental responsibility. So it is very urgent for us to define the approach in that regard. So the revival for me is, clothed in those three terms: uncertainty, lack of trust, and urgency to deliver inclusive and sustainable trade, investment, and connectivity. Thank you, Foucault.
Thank you very much, Mia. Maybe I started with a sort of pessimistic tone, so probably you set a tone like that. But I think, your points are talking about the erosion of trust and also enhancing uncertainty and urgency for some important issues like environmental issues. I think that those are very important points right now. I think still economy is really moving very actively, at least in Asia, I think. But policy discussion is really toward sort of geopolitics very strongly. So we have a sort of bifurcation between policymakers, bureaucrats, and private sector somehow. So hopefully that we can find a way to maintain a sort of a dynamic economy somehow. So that's probably we have to talk about a bit more. So thank you very much. I will come back to that issue. So next, can I go to Hosuk Lee Makiyama? Dr. Hosuk Lee Makiyama is director of ECIPE in Brussels and the senior fellow of London School of Economics. His research on trade and technology has played a prominent role in reforming policies around the world, while his advice has been sought by G7 governments and various organizations, including the European Commission, ASEAN, OECD, World Bank, WTO, and the UN. So, Hosuk, could you make an initial speech, please?
Thank you. I think I will join in on the careful optimist-pessimist balance, and I'm a very much a glass half empty person because I grew up in the world of trade, and where the key question is if not the glass is half empty or half full, but it's actually who drank out of your glass. And actually, I tend to be a little bit more realistic than normal, because I think we have to really look at the fundamentals of global macroeconomics. I think it's abundantly clear that the export-led growth is really not going to be on the table for the foreseeable future. I mean, despite the many bottlenecks we have in the supply chain, there are still overcapacity in the manufacturing. There was never really adjusted from the last economic crisis in most G20 countries. And also, in addition, we have entered into a highly inflationary regime on a global scale, which will further suppress exports. Only 2 or 3 countries in G20 might keep inflation under 3%. And with such dire prospects, I'm not really sure who is interested in paying for a very expensive ask in trade policy with very little reward. This is not the time. And if export-led growth is really not on the table, how can I say? I mean, no one commands that kind of fiscal firepower, either by shoring up public spending with and share them with foreign businesses, or no one in the G20 countries have that kind of political capital domestically to convince his or her political opponents that we are going to play a demandeur in a major trade negotiation. I think we have to be very realistic about these prospects. And if a round of negotiation even happens, I'm not sure if it's going to be a positive one. It might even be a negative one with very unambiguous and clear exclusions and exceptions and safeguards that are applied to today's relatively ambiguous rules that are in place. And I think digital and connectivity is a great example of this. And several G20 countries are now currently revising their data processing and transfer laws, including Europe as well as Indonesia. And these are rooted in very firm and genuine concern for fundamental rights and extraterritorial application of domestic laws in pretty strong areas like hate speech or enforce income tax laws on profits that get repatriated abroad. And I think also war in Ukraine really changes our paradigm around trade and not least energy paradigm, of course. Although it is a politically highly regionalized and self-contained conflict, especially if you have an Asian set of eyes, it is primarily a European conflict. But several countries must revert to either coal or see their productivity affected. And with rising prices on energy imports, net importers of energy will aggressively continue to display imports to balance current account. And in addition to that, we have several of those environmentally justified measures, for example, like carbon border adjustment measures in Europe. We have seen ban on biofuels, and related to those issues, we have forced labor provisions and seizures by the customs on suspected items. And in other words, this is not a good time for grand bargains and multilateral rules. And I'm not even sure that the most ardent free trader is going to like the rules that are negotiated under current circumstances. I will point really to the investment for a different, more positive view. But I would also argue that the business and international responses from now and in the coming years will be highly uncoordinated and perhaps even unsatisfactory. Several countries have encouraged onshoring and consolidating supply chains locally rather than dispersing them. And it is not necessarily a bad thing, if you hear me out. The underlying problem is not about free trade or globalization. The underlying problem is actually much more harder to fix, because if this mass concentration actually happened just because of free trade policy, it would be pretty easy to fix, because then the government can just change their policies. But it's actually about how business, mostly multinational, have chosen to ignore macro political risks. If you put all the eggs in one basket, you save cost and save scale production. That's great. But you will eventually run into production issues in any country. Maybe not war, maybe not disease, they can be avoided. But bad politics and logistical clusterfucks, they happen everywhere. So everybody plays now the incentive game in critical items like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. Will they pay off? I would argue that they won't. Those companies will respond to these fiscal incentives are not the ones, the companies that you want. We'll see many empty factories where companies have received incentives up front, but never goes into production in a number of areas. So I will end by returning to the big picture. The business response to the pandemic was mainly to focus not on trade, but on investments, and especially in fixed assets, and notably into China. It's understandable. When the rest of the world had their lights turned off, China was already out of the tunnel. China, or actually even investment into China, accounted for more than 100% of global growth in 2020. And China still accounts for, 30-40% of global GDP, and it's still a substantial number. Lots of countries want to tap into that demand. So it's not really surprising that Beijing wants to talk CPTPP and DEPA, market access with Europe. Now is their time. Now they have the leverage to play. And with foreign investment law being revised in China, there is a window, but the window is extremely rigid. Foreign capital is also a source of corruption, and corruption threatens the legitimacy of any party or any government in any country. So if nobody is in a position to offer concessions on trade and current account, we have to turn to investment, liberalizing financial account in exchange for more investment protection. And the only real disagreement we have on the table is now whether we actually need trade negotiators or mutual mechanisms like G20 in order to achieve that. And if so, who is ready to play the demander? Thank you.
Thank you, Hosik. You are more pessimistic than me, actually. You start out from global macroeconomy. I think that's a very important observation. Then the possible role that trade could play would be not much at this timing. You're quite right. And also various efforts to set up sort of policy discipline, those are not really working quite well. And also you talked about the response of multinationals. Those are not really in the direction of solving a sort of uncertainty over there. And China recovered much quicker than other countries in the world. And so I think those are what we observe here. So yeah, in the second round, hopefully you would deliver us a little bit positive what to do somehow and doing that. Okay, let's turn to Mr. Bani Maulaya Mulia. Pak Bani served as a managing director of Samudera Indonesia since 2009 and as its CEO and president director since 2020. The group comprises more than 100 subsidiaries in the shipping, ports, and logistics businesses. As a CEO, he oversees the overall group strategy and has been leading the business development and expansion. He served as vice chairman of the permanent committee of sea transportation in the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, so-called Kadin, Indonesia, and the transportation and energy department of the Indonesian Employers Association, APindo. He studied in the University of Indonesia, Faculty of Economics, majoring in management, and the Deakin University, Australia, majoring in finance. So, Pak Bani, could you make an initial speech, please?
Yes, thank you very much to the chair as well as to the organizers for having me in this discussion. Yeah, I think one of the comments that I'm interested to discuss is I'm one of the players in the shipping industry, and we adjust to what the situation is. And I think one of the points that we are seeing and experiencing is how China is really proved to be affecting everything globally. See, when there's now for shipping, there's a question whether COVID-19, whether we can recover or revive from the crisis. But actually for shipping, I will be bluntly honest to you, this is actually a blessing in disguise, and it's the best momentum for all shipping companies in the world, for the industry in the world. So it's not about reviving for them. They are breaking historical performances. Yes, operationally is very challenging, but for most of all shipping companies in the world, they are making the biggest profit ever due to the situation. And that wasn't expected before, but then how did that happen? That happened because of the faster recovery of China compared to the rest of the world, and the capacity, the dominance capacity of China to provide the products that later on will be in increasingly high demand being ordered from the rest of the world, and especially from the US and Northern America and Europe. that has lifted up the global freight rates all over the world. But then now today, as per today, it's only weakened because of the lockdown in China again, the lockdown in Shanghai. That's the only thing that can slow down the spike, the high freight rates, freight shipping rates. And suddenly it also affects all the shipping freight rates all over the world because of the China zero tolerance policy. So I think if I may comment on anything, is just this make us realize how we other countries in G20 as well can see how we can see how we can survive without with this dominance. Is already a fact that the dominance is there, but for me, being a private sector player in shipping, we will always need to adjust to what the market situation is. That's how we survive. But then I think that's an opening question for me, how we can survive and seeing the future when we see that even with the energy crisis now, we know that in shipping as well, we will be transforming and transitioning into zero carbon, and therefore investing in more greener fuel and technology for our industry as well. And that is a big question now that because of the crisis, then the target will probably be a bit further away. And also with the AI technology and robotics, this will come into play, whether the reliance on lockdowns may be gone in the future if production are no longer heavily depending on human activity. So I think I'd be very interested to hear from all the panelists and the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Bani. I think, the recovery is really led by China. That's one fact. But at the same time, you can see sort of really active economic activities in the region. So even if the policy discussion is really in a kind of mess right now, so how we can utilize those kind of economic dynamism for economic development. That is certainly a big agenda that we have to deliver in G20, I think. So I'd like to come back later a little bit more on that. Okay, move to the fourth panelist, Ibu Amalia Adinda Ria Santi. Thank you for joining us. Amalia is a Deputy Minister for Economic Affairs, Ministry of National Development Planning. The Deputy Minister for Economic Affairs is responsible for coordinating, formulating, implementing, monitoring, evaluating, and controlling the National Development Plan, specifically in the area of economics. This will also include the macroeconomic framework. Apart from that, climate change issues and risks, as well as achieving the SDGs, is also her concern in this regard to expedite the achievement of sustainable financial inclusion in Indonesia. So you're taking care of everything. So probably you would provide a little bit more better answer for us. So could you give us the initial speech first?
Thank you very much, Fukunari-san, and also Ibu Mia Mikik. Nice to meet you here again. And everyone that I cannot mention one by one. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this important discussion. Pak Fukunari, I just want to ask how many minutes that I have for this, so I can manage my slide. You're still in mute mode. You're still muted. You're still muted, Pak Fukunari?
Yeah, I think 5 minutes. That's the original idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me share some of my slides for this one, Pak Fukunari. That Actually, I would like to share with you regarding to the trade and investment policy of Indonesia in the future, given the fact that we are in the uncertainty situation, and again, Indonesia is also including in the that will get an impact from the Russia and Ukraine, based on our exercise with Oxford Economics, that if there is like a lengthened crisis regarding to Russia and Ukraine, then it will cause a decrease of Indonesian economic growth, and the economic growth will be slowing down. But at the same time, Indonesia needs to grow faster. As you know that Indonesia have a target of economic growth in 2022 around 5.2%. And in 2023, we are planning to have an economic growth in 2023 between 5.3 to 5.9%. This is not an easy situation that we can achieve that target of economic growth. At the same time, if it is there is like a lengthy war between Russia and Ukraine, Indonesia is possibly to slow down by 0.3 basis point. So I think this is not this is a situation that we have to mitigate. And I just would like to share with you regarding that what Indonesia will be doing, especially after the COVID-19 crisis. We know that Indonesia is recovering, the economic is recovering, but the thing is that Indonesia still have some homework before the COVID, that the productivity of Indonesian economy is slowing down actually. But the thing is that those homework is now added into the effect of COVID-19 crisis, that this, we call it the scarce effect from the COVID-19 is mostly on the production side. This is the economic scars that we are now experiencing. As you know that there is a decreased productivity in our economy, decrease in productivity of labor, and also decrease in productivity of capital. So with that, we would like to really strengthen our policy in trade and investment, especially foreign trade policy direction in 2022. We are going to push export, especially for a more value-added product. And the other one is that foreign trade policy for stage 1 and stage 2 and stage 3. And in stage 1, until 2024-5, we will be focusing on reducing economic barriers with our partner countries. And again, trade is very important to increase productivity in the macro and micro sides. Trade is one of the determinants of economic growth, including for Indonesia. And we believe that trade will lead to increase the productivity of Indonesia, especially through the channel of competition, economies of scale, as well as learning and innovation, and access to the input availability. So with that, I would like to share with you regarding to the foreign trade policy and strategy direction in 2023. And the policy direction is actually to improve the export of high value added goods and services, to improve the economic productivity with the strategy of increasing the export of manufactured products, and increase the participation of Indonesian firms into the global value chain. And for domestic trade policy strategy and direction in 2023, we will strengthen the domestic trade ecosystem and the use of technology, digital technology, to improve the economic productivity, especially to strengthen national logistics, utilization of digital technology, and also to improve business competition and consumer protection. we would like to shift from inward-looking policy to outward-looking policy that can encourage private sectors to export, not only to fill the domestic market. And again, let's export is actually one of the campaign that we are now trying to implement. This is to really encourage the Indonesian firms and also the firms invested in Indonesia to really do export. So for investment policy, we will focus on investment that can direct to export, and also investment that really can improve the manufacturing sector outputs. We also will focus on the inclusive investment and sustainable investment. I think I'll stop there, Pak Fukunari, and we can have like a more detailed explanation during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramali. I think Indonesia is really keeping a sort of a healthy line of policy. I think that's very, very important. And then the issue is probably how we can make that message in a kind of convincing manner in G20. So I think G7 is really now a sort of pessimistic tone, actually. So somehow that kind of healthy talk will be sort of dominant in the G20. So that's a very important message. Thank you very much. Some missing elements, actually, we got a question or a comment from Jane Drake-Brookman. I think that's a very important one. So we didn't talk about digital technology much, actually, or digital economy much. So Hosuk is certainly a sort of expert on that, and Mia can answer for that too. And others can comment on that too. So actually under COVID-19, she said that we observed the acceleration of growth in the digital services trade. Then even in the current difficult situation, still we may see some sort of good, bright picture for the development of digitalized trade in a sense. So that could be one channel that we could think of globalization as a sort of very important approach for economic development. Could you kindly add some sort of comments on the question or something related to the introduction of digital technology, particularly for developing countries?
Yeah, I think digital technology is really an opportunity for all of us, especially that in the era of automation and digitalization, we understand there will be like job losses, but at the same time, there will be some other jobs will be created. And for this one, I think based on the situation that digital technology is really in front of us, then the thing is that we really need to utilize the digital technology, and by making them by a digital technology can be adopted into the digital logistics system and can create a more seamless flow of goods. So I think we need really to work together between the countries to how can we apply and implement digital technology to make a flow of goods more seamless. And again, when we can really ensure the use of this digital technology to improve the economy, I believe that it will get a good impact to strengthen the global value chain, especially the regional value chain after the COVID. So what I would like to mention is that after the COVID-19 crisis, that we need to strengthen collaboration among countries because during the COVID-19 that each country really shifting to the more inward-looking policies. And I think this is the one that we need to really shift the policy to be more outward-looking, and we can collaborate with countries to strengthen the economic recovery, even not only recovery, but we need to do some economic reform and to really ensure, like Indonesia, economic recovery is not enough. But the thing is that we need to transform our economy to get growing in the future. As you know, based on our exercise, Pak Fukunari, the Indonesian economic potential growth is declining after COVID-19. If we don't do, if we only do the business usual process. So Indonesia, if really would like to get growing quite high in the future to escape from middle income trap, then Indonesia really need to transfer our economy to improve the economic potentials. To improve the potential growth of our economy, so we can get growing faster in the long term. So digital technology will be one of the engine of growth for Indonesia. So meaning that digital technology will be very much important to improve the productivity, improve a more efficient trade, and it can really improve our competitiveness. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very important message, particularly for developing countries, and how we can utilize digital technology in a really positive manner. And also that will really help sustain a sort of economic dynamism. Hopefully we could provide that kind of a positive message in G22. Hosuk or Mia, could you supplement some may I have some supplementary message for supporting the introduction of digital technology, and also in order to keep a sort of an active trade and investment, digital trade is also very important too, I think. Could you elaborate that point? Maybe Mia?
Hosuk, do you want to go first, or shall I?
Mia, then going to Hosuk, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I just wanted to bring another element. Of course, we can discuss the importance of digitalization in the context of logistics, and I hope we'll have time to go there because through the pandemic we have realized actually both the importance of logistics, but also the digitalization of processes in the context of that sector. But I want to bring actually some other elements because investment was mentioned, and UNCTAD just recently, in the context of the e-commerce week, issued the report on FDI monitoring of 100 largest digital corporates or M&Es in the world. And I wanted to bring to the discussion the sort of conclusions of, or what came through this report, as well as the reports of some other firms and think tanks. And so what is important to understand is that investment, or the M&Es that are involved in digital sectors, they are what UNCTAD calls FDI light, because their share of the sales that are done with foreign affiliates compared to the share of physical investment in assets is much larger than for the traditional companies. And of course, this is easy to understand when you see that the internet and other sort of digital corporates like that do not necessarily need to have large investments in the location. Slightly more is related to the e-commerce providers, because they need to have distributional channels, etc. I think what is also important is to understand that the sales of these largest companies that are concentrated in the advanced economies, US, Europe, and very few in Asia, and some in China and some otherwise, have increased multiple times in a 5-year period that was measured. What is also important, and I will just list these, is that the factors influencing investment of these companies are slightly different from the factors that influence investment of traditional multinationals. And that's very important for developing countries and also for our discussion on where the supply chains can go. So the first 5 important factors of locating the investment is transparency of government regulation, is capability for technological innovation, is the easiness of paying taxes and understanding the tax systems. The 4th one is ease of moving capital in and out of the country. And the 5th one is the clarity on investor and property rights. The bottom 5 factors, and this is very important because it is very different from traditional companies. The last one is availability of land and real estate, research and development capacities, meaning that these companies will hold research and development in the headquarters, will not go down to move it with their business. 3rd from the bottom, domestic economic performance. We are often thinking it's more important than it is for these companies. The 4th from the bottom is a quality of physical infrastructure, not digital, but physical infrastructure. And the last one, which is important, is cost of labor, or not important at all for these companies. And again, this is easy to see because they can actually source skilled labor from all over the place and not necessarily in the location where they invest. So I think it is important to understand these specific features of companies that are working in digital sector, and also how they plan to engage in investments, and that will affect the supply chain in participation of developing countries as well. Thank you, Foucault.
Yeah, so I think certainly multinational enterprises in digital-related businesses and also foreign direct investment. I think those are very important issues. And from the viewpoint of developing countries, probably at least they have to have some sort of backup policies, particularly on competition and taxation, and what Europe and US are doing is the right one or not. We really have to make a judgment. But many developing countries do not have that kind of regulatory system yet. So certainly they have to do those kind of things to introduce a sort of dynamic economic activities in a kind of really well-controlled manner in a sense. So that should be one of the issues certainly. Hosuk, could you elaborate a point a little bit more on utilizing digital economy or digital trade in the context of this difficult time?
Absolutely. This was actually exactly the point I was going to raise. It's actually a great segue. But I will start by saying that, and thanking Jane for the fantastic question, and she's actually great. She should be here in the panel instead of me. She's actually much smarter and also much nicer. I'm not surprised that this very pertinent question comes from her. I touched upon this, that I also mentioned that digital is one of the particularly difficult agenda items to negotiate, and maybe I should try to unpack that a little bit. It's actually for the reason that you mentioned, Kimura-sensei, that we have both Europe and United States actually going through, and also Indonesia, a number of reforms on data processing and data transfers. Indonesia actually moving towards the better direction, whereas actually Europe has made it much more restrictive. Fundamentally, it is about a concern about, fundamental rights. And I talked about the extraterritorial effect of US-European laws, which means that if you have your own governance of hate speech, public order, or even income tax, you don't necessarily trust that Europe or United States is going to enforce your rules for you if it's concerning one of their platforms or service providers. Fair enough. I don't think we will be able to solve this. But if we come back to the question about market concentration, that's a little bit of an odd one. Europe has now introduced Digital Markets Act because of the huge platforms. But if we're really honest about it, Amazon don't account for less than, let's say, 2-3% at most of a consumer's wallet, whereas a supermarket accounts for maybe 40-50%. We haven't regulated supermarkets, and we are not concerned about market concentration at all. But the one that is actually cutting a 1% slice of every country and able to scale demand globally by being the marginal player, that's the one we go after. And that raises a number of questions, especially in Southeast Asia, where case law around antitrust is not developed, and where we might see a number of product laws that is directly governing platforms. And it's very easy to see that many of our friends may go through several iterations before they get it right. And on top of this, I should perhaps add that there is genuine concern, because especially around what Mia was saying, that this is actually digital services and digital trade provides a lot of benefits, a lot of consumer gain, but adds very little to the economy in the short term. Until you see the unleashing of digital manufacturing and larger scale deployment of digital services and full adaptation of these technologies and know-how, it will take a while before the productivity effect is actually unleashing the gains that are really, really tangible. Whereas it's easy to look at current account and the cost in, for example, loss of tax revenue or potential tax revenue that you think that you should have, not the United States government. And this is a very, very valid point, because politicians usually only sit for four to 10 years, depending on which country you're in and what kind of systems you have. I'm not going to comment on that. But fundamentally, it means that quick fixes is going to be necessary for some political leaders. Now, I would like to turn this attention to, rather than the free flows, I would like to focus on the trust part. Because this comes back to the question about, can another neighboring country or United States or Europe or Indonesia for that matter, can they enforce the rules on behalf of someone? If you have trust, if you have mutual legal assistance, you can do it, and you can actually allow free flows. And in that regard, I think G20 is perhaps the best suited organization and the mechanism that we can have to actually create, not necessarily trust, because trust comes from something completely different, from a completely different political process, but the trade-off between openness and trust that data free flow with trust and other mechanisms are talking about. So in other words, set the price for openness. If you sign these legal assistance treaties, or if you harmonize the laws in the following manner, I can be completely open to you. I have no reason to localize data. I have no reason to steal your tax revenue. So these kind of, let's say, soft law approaches will be absolutely necessary, and I think G20 is an excellent place to start.
Right. Thank you very much. I think, certainly we have various kinds of players in G20. So, kind of really concrete proposal could be a little bit difficult at this moment. But the message is very important. I think we really need a trust in many aspects, of course, but including a sort of data flows, definitely. And without that, we have to have a lot of data localization requirements and other things. So I think that's another probably message that we can convey to G20, definitely. Thank you very much. So I think time is really running out to some extent. So Pak Bani, I think from the viewpoint of doing a sort of economic activities by yourself, different from us, I think you have to say something on what the G20 should deliver for further activating the businesses. I think that's very important to get those kind of opinions from the economic private sector. So Pak Bani, could you give us some ideas even if I leave it the bold ones.
Thank you. Well, just following up on the topic, I think it'd be very interesting to see in the near future how the implementation of this digitalization and AI, particularly in my industry, in shipping and ports, it already exists. The technology already exists. It's already being implemented in many places. I know we can see it being used in European ports, in some Asian ports as well. The automation and less reliance on the human operators, and it's in place, but probably not in the most busier ports, or not on a larger scale. But it will. It already exists, and if it's already being implemented on all the major ports right now, then we would not have the current port congestion and supply chain crisis as we are having. Because as you see, currently the problems that we experience in the US that involving truck drivers right now as well in Shanghai. The ports are still operating, but of course truck drivers are being affected. But what if all the container trucks are moved by automated trucks, and all the workers in the hub ports such as Shanghai or even Singapore or LA, all those big ports are all operated automatically. In one factor for the supply chain, that will become a solution, but of course there will be a big shift for the workers and for us to for the industry as well. But seemingly that's something that digitalization and implementation of it in larger scale will bring to the shipping and ports industry and through the global supply chain. And probably we will see that in the future. I don't know how G20 will try to can also contribute on testing the impacts. Many of the member countries already have the technology in place, and I think we can see more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Hosuk put some notes on the chat. I think the possible usage of AI you said that the narrow down shipments that may have some problems in the sanctions and others. So then your intention is that the rest of the cargoes could move quickly rather than sort of just hanging around at the port. Is that the point, Hosuk?
No, exactly. I was just supporting Mr. Mulia's point, and I think that was a great intervention actually. So it is already in use, and well, there's always a technological advancement in times of sanctions and wars, unfortunately.
Right. I think, yeah, even if a sort of a mixture of managed trade and sort of a free trade in a sense, I think the usage of AI could be a sort of one of the ideas, certainly. So that's great. So I think we have, I think, 8 minutes left. So I think probably one by one for 1 or 2 minutes that if you miss something to give the G20 that we can deliver some sort of hopefully positive messages. I think Amalia did as a really good job. So I think I put you at the end. So starting from Mia, Hosuk, Pakbani, and then go back to Ibu Amalia. What we can deliver to so G20 and what G20 can do in 1 or 2 minutes. Start from Mia, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Foucault. This is a very, I'm normally more an optimist than pessimist, but the current situation is very challenging. It's very, very difficult to be very optimistic. But I think we should actually positively look at the efforts that are done with vaccine distribution, and these will be strengthening. So hopefully the opening of countries will continue, and these, and hopefully in Asia in particular, will not be negatively affected by the war. And so the mobility of people around, and the revival of tourism and travel sectors might provide some positive sort of impetus in these economies that can spread around the world as well. And I think also, in particular for Asia Pacific, the RCEP being brought into force, and the countries now aiming towards utilizing these to expand on participation in regional value chains might provide some positive context that can again have some positive spillover effects to other parts, to other economies, at least to be a demonstration effect that cooperation and trade and investment actually is positive some game, and that countries globally should engage more in that way. Thank you, Foucault.
Yeah, thank you, Mia. So, Jose, please.
Thank you. I would just reiterate my point that now is perhaps not the time to try to collect concessions or new rules on trade and current account. It's just our political masters just don't think it's worth it. We have to turn to investments. And liberalizing financial account is not necessarily something that you do in a trade agreement. It's not necessarily a quid pro quo trade negotiation outcome we are looking for. We are looking at a much broader framework, I think, in exchange for investment protections. We have to look for more openness. And certainly business has a very important, investors have a much more important role to play in terms of determining the modalities, if you like, of such a conversation that should take place in G20. And I will return to the original question where I began my intervention, which is, but all this needs an ignition to start, which means who is going to play the demander? Who is going to say that they have a bunch of market access and investment to offer on the table in return for something else, or reciprocity? And I think we have to look very, very closely amongst the G20 countries and who is best equipped to do that. And if that doesn't happen, we will all micromanage, and it will lead to a suboptimal result, because everybody will do their thing. Everybody will try to incentivize investment. And in the end, this is not going to lead to better quality of investment. It's not going to be a more equitable share. It's going to be worse for everyone. So I call for self-coordination on these issues. We don't necessarily need a piece of paper on the table signed, but we need to have the conversation taking place between the technocrats as well as the political leaders, and that set the framework for what do we give in return for what. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Pak Bani, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think this year is a very interesting year for us to really think about what the G20 can do with the ongoing geopolitical tension and crisis, and COVID having come and probably going away or coming to new situation. But we can already see the effects and what countries can do and what G20 can add on. And so I think just an opening to later on, passing from Ibu Amalia, I think hopefully the G20 led by Indonesian initiative can give ideas how the countries can agree on implementing some policies together in empowering technologies to become solutions of what issues that's happening at the moment geopolitically. Sanctions, as in the way I see it from a private sector point of view, sanctions, I question the effectivity of how sanctions can stop whether you want to call it crime or whether you want to call it war, but in the fact it doesn't stop it, and it has a lot of economic factors, and doesn't only affect the sanctioned country by itself, but it actually affected industries. It actually affected all the other non-sanctioned countries as well. When you sanction someone that is also have a lot of economic cooperation with a lot of other countries. So we need to figure out a more effective way to live together in harmony and going forward new ideas. So I guess the G20 can really think about that, and this is a real case situation where it is a lot of grave concerns, but I think all of us in G20 are looking for positive solutions, positive ideas, and that's coming from me. I think that's what I would make my notes on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Pani. I think, Amalia, I think you are really trying to deliver us a very right message. I think that kind of really healthy message is really needed. G20 is a forum that newly developed and developing economies are delivering some important messages to the world. And now G7's policy discussion is a little bit in a kind of tone of pessimism, but I think it's very important to give you a really important and healthy message to the world. So, Eva Maria, sorry, it's going to be overtime now. Sorry for my time management. But just 1 or 2 minutes. Could you give us some last message?
Yes, thank you, Fukunari. Given the challenging economic situation in the future, now and in the future, such as the geopolitical situation, and also we are facing the effect of fiscal burden due to the carry over effect from the pandemic. That during the pandemic, countries are really have a fiscal burden that can affect to until now. And right now, we also having a smaller rooms for fiscal and monetary policy. So meaning that we have to find and to pursue other policies, other creative policies that can create growth for countries and the regions. So G20 and countries in the regions have to work together and try to put away the political tension and really work together to find the new engines of economic growth, new paradigm of trade and investment policies to be able we have a more resilient and inclusive growth, especially for the region and the world.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's great. I started with a really pessimistic tone, but at the end, I think you are delivering a really right message to the world. So hopefully that we will deliver a sort of important message that really active economic dynamism is very, very important for the world. And even in this really difficult situation, we really have to promote trade, investment, and connectivity. So hopefully that Indonesia would give G20 to G20 for really important message like that in the coming meetings. So thank you very much, panelists. I really appreciate that. And also we got some questions, particularly Jane, Drake Brockman. Thank you very much for coming us. So sorry, it's already over time, but this is our last session, so maybe the organizer would allow us to do that. So thank you very much, and I'd like to close the session. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Fukunari Kimura, and all of our honorable speakers for the fourth plenary session. Ladies and gentlemen, that marks the end for our event today. We hope the participants here benefit from the remarkable insight that our speakers have shared today. We will have 2 more sessions for tomorrow on building human capital for social cohesion and inclusive digital economy, and the way forward for G20 Indonesia 2022. Tomorrow's agenda will start at 2 p.m. Jakarta time.
Make sure you have registered to attend the sessions on our event's last day tomorrow. Visit global-dialogue.csis.or.id. I'm going to repeat that one more time. global-dialogue.csis.or.id for registration and access to the event program and agenda, as well as the presentation material. The 2022 CSIS Global Dialogue is hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and co-organized by the Asian Development Bank, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, and T20 Indonesia. See you tomorrow and have a great day.
The COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on lives, well-being, and economies in Asia and the Pacific, along with the rest of the world. Since the beginning of the pandemic at the start of 2020, ADB has committed more than $17.5 billion to help its developing member countries address the impacts of COVID-19 and address vaccination needs, and has mobilized a further $12.5 billion in co-financing from partners. From the earliest stages, ADB offered technical assistance to address Asia and the Pacific's most pressing needs, including medical equipment and supplies, improving laboratories, and training frontline workers. To mitigate the immediate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, ADB committed $10.2 billion to support governments' counter-cyclical expenditure programs in 26 countries. Some $501.7 million has been helping private companies provide medical equipment and essential services. And ADB committed $3.2 billion for trade finance, supply chain finance, and microfinance programs. ADB is also providing crucial knowledge to help countries better tackle the pandemic and shape a greener recovery. This includes databases on policy measures, supply chains, and economic impacts. As the world kickstarts a sustainable recovery from COVID-19, ADB is delivering comprehensive support to meet Asia and the Pacific's vaccine needs. Through a $9 billion Asia-Pacific Vaccine Access Facility, or APVAX, announced in December 2020, ADB is providing funding for vaccine procurement, logistics, and distribution. The initiative also supports important investments to build capacity in vaccine delivery, community outreach, and surveillance. Throughout its COVID-19 response operations, ADB is working closely with partners, including other international financial institutions, bilateral institutions, and the UN system. ADB is adapting with agility to the region's changing circumstances, working together with its developing member countries to rebuild for a long-lasting recovery.
In 2008, an international research organization was founded that would seek to have a positive influence on relationships and policymaking within and between the countries of ASEAN and East Asia. This is AREA, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia.
When AREA was first mooted, the thinking was we need a very substantial economic research body.
It's very important for an organization like ASEAN to have the backing academically for what it wants to do. And that's why AREA fills in the gap and helps provide the research.
It's more about providing the information that's needed for the negotiators or for the political decision makers.
We are not a pure academic institution. We must do the more practical policy recommendation.
And AREA's role, of course, is also to promote the talking through of sensible policy developments, and it plays a fundamentally important role in that respect. And AREA is now accepted as one of the major research institutes in East Asia as a whole.
After its first decade of input into the development of ASEAN, AREA must now be ready to meet the challenges of the future.
We believe that issues like sustainable development, like environment, issues like education, humanitarian aspect of it, which we think AREA has the capacity to develop expertise and provide policy recommendation to ASEAN.
AREA, hopefully in the not too distant future, will become like the OECDs of our region.
AREA will continue to contribute to the community building of ASEAN and East Asia.
At the current affairs where we witnessed lingering COVID-19 pandemic, global economic recovery remained unfavorable to be achieved. Global inequality rise to a level that never seen in the past decade. Mobility restriction policies resulting from COVID-19 prevention measures have disabled many communities to fulfill their daily needs. Risks of divisions between social groups exacerbated as the threat of scarring effect to the future generations, as well as increased risk of systemic default that put financial sector under pressure, have made the exit strategy from COVID-19 pandemic even more challenging to be executed. Such risks also result in prolonged trust deficit among countries that slow down efforts to tackle greater long-term issues, such as climate change and massive biodiversity extinction. All of these phenomena need to be followed with better formulation of economic and policy approach under one coordinated action. The Think 20, or better known as the T20, is the G20's official engagement group that connects think tanks worldwide. The T20 serves as a global ideas bank, bringing together experts from the most relevant think tanks and research institutes worldwide. The T20 develop and communicate research-based policy recommendations to the G20 leaders. In its 10th year, the T20 under the Indonesian presidency will be present to systematically produce practical policy proposals for G20 decision makers. This year, T20 highlighted 3 strategic issues. First, promoting greater cooperation for stronger, balanced, and resilient recovery. Achieving resilient and inclusive economic recovery simultaneously by global economies is essential to reduce the risk of having prolonged crises that affect unevenly across social classes. Second, advancing concerted effort for inclusive and sustainable development. Post-pandemic development in times of changing climates needs to also consider environmental issues, while also inclusive to all communities and aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And third, managing digital transformation to utilize technological progress. The unprecedented digital transformation as a result from COVID-19 pandemic should align with innovation that benefits communities worldwide. These strategic issues will be discussed further by think tanks across the world under the coordination of T20 Indonesia's 9 task forces. Together, these task forces, as well as all T20 participants, will join under our series of events. Alongside the support provided by these task forces, T20 Indonesia will be led by our lead co-chairs as well as executive co-chairs. The T20 Indonesia, hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Institute for Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia, both are think tanks that play important roles in policy-oriented research. Recover together, recover stronger.